First, I want to talk to you about a fellow named Colin Billington, who was my maths teacher in early high school. And Mr. Billington was just an ugly character. He was abusive. He wasn't physically abusive, but he was shaming and he would crack into kids' heads with his words. And he just, I think that was just his sport, to embarrass and to abuse and belittle everybody. And I had him right through 2 years of early high school. And so two things stick in my head about Mr. Billington. One was a time when one of the girls got something wrong and he just savagely turned on her. And he said, well, when you come to school tomorrow, we'll leave the block of wood at home and bring your head. And the girl just shrunk. And when you've got somebody in a community who uses shame to control people in a way that is totally inhuman, what it does is it induces shame in others. And I can remember as a 12-year-old, and it's 60 years ago for me, and I can remember thinking, I'm glad it's her and not me. And then immediately I felt I reckon that's a shameful thing to think, that just because it's not me, somehow I should be glad about something. That's Mr. Billington. Another thing I remember about Mr. Billington is when, because he thought I was an idiot, and I used to say so, and I was heading to school one time and Mum said, you got your homework done? Because that all had to be checked. And I said, yeah, most of it. And she said, most of it? And I said, well, there's one maths thing I can't figure out. She said, well, okay, let's spend a few minutes before you head off, and we'll just see whether we can do it. We opened up, and I had 5 things in homework, and I couldn't do one of them. And she looked at it, and now I knew that getting my mum to help with mathematics wasn't much use, because she was older than me, and also grew up in a time when mathematical problems got done differently. And she'd say, that's not how you do long division. I said, yes, it is. This is how you do it. And I thought, what are you doing there? What are you doing? And so anyway, she looked at this, and she looked at the textbook where the problem was written out. You know, one of those problems like, you know, a train goes at 60 miles an hour from here to B, and at the end of the platform there's a flagpole, and how old's the taxi driver? You know, one of those sort of crazy things that you just cannot understand. And it had numbers in it, and Mum looked at it and she said, yeah, but here it says 72, and over here you've got 27. Now I'm going to stop for a minute. I was nearly 60 when I found out I was dyslexic. It had been plaguing me my whole life in reading and writing, and especially with numbers. And I didn't know that whatever was going on in my head wasn't going on in everybody's head. And I didn't know why I was making the errors that I was making. But I've written stuff. And so I know that I'm smart enough to do the thing, but my brain just sees things the wrong way, and it messes things up, and things won't stay on the page properly. So when I look at a page, it's a thing called rivers of white. Anyone with dyslexia might know rivers of white, where all the words squeeze up and all the spaces get apart, and all you see is sort of like looking at the Amazon basin. You just see this mass of white rivers coming down the thing. Anyway, so Mum said, this says 72, but you've got 27. And I said, oh, so we changed that. And then suddenly, boom, oh, hang on, this is it. Boom, 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 this. And so off I went. Well, when we got to school at, maths, and went through, and Mr. Billington gave us the answers, and he said, number 4 was the really tricky one, a bit hard. Who got that? And I put my hand up, and hardly anybody else did. And he said, well, I know you're too much of an idiot, so what, Peter did that for you? Pete's my older brother. Peter did that for you, did he? And that was it. And I thought, I've got the answer to this thing, and it's just being belittled. So that's Mr. Billington, Colin Billington. See, his name lives in my head still. Now, let's go forward a whole bunch of years. I was prison chaplain at Bathurst. And we had a program called Kairos. Some of you have heard of Kairos. We get a lot of volunteers into the jail to work with people. One of the volunteers was my motor mechanic, and I was there to pick the car up one afternoon, and his name was Rod, and he said, oh, Kim, this is Ted. Ted's just retired. I reckon you'd be a good volunteer for us on the Kairos program. I said, oh, well, good to meet you, Ted. What have you retired from? And he said, school teacher. And then straight away I said, well, that's okay, unless you were a maths teacher. And he said, well, sorry to say so, but I was a maths teacher. And I said, well, this is just going to be the end of our friendship, Ted, because there's a guy named Mr. Billington who still lives in my head, and he won't let me be your friend. And he said, "Oh, you mean Colin?" And I said, "You know him?" He said, "Colin Billington." Yeah, he said he retired a little while ago, but he does the books for us out at the Sports and Social Club at Kelso. And I said, "He's in Bathurst." And he said, yeah, he lives out at Eglinton. And I said, "Well, I live at Eglinton. It's a suburb." And that was a ghost from the past I didn't expect. And so I have no idea how my conversation went from there with Ted, but I went home and I told Kay, and I got out the phone book. When all the old people remember phone books. And so I looked up and there he was. He lived 2 streets away. And I thought, this is just not fair. You know, there's the whole of Australia he could have retired to, and he retired to a minute's walk away from me. And so I'm going to have to ring him. And so I did. And so I rang him and the phone said, "Hello." And I said, "Is that Mr. Colin Billington, who used to be the maths teacher out at Condo back through the 60s? And this voice said, "Might be." And I thought, that's it. There's a voice. I can, even just the attitude that comes through, "might be," you know, I could, a bit of swagger in it. And I said, "Oh boy." And I said, well, I introduced myself and I said, "I just lived around the corner. I thought I might come round and say hello." And he said, "Hang on a minute." Yeah, he said, "That'd be good. Hang on, I'll just get the wife. We'll get a day." And so anyway, come back and said, "Yeah, Thursday afternoon after work." And I said, "That'd be fine." So I went around there Thursday afternoon, just walking around. Now, I was going to do what my mum called putting a flea in your ear, which means I'm going to tell you how it is, mate, you know. And I've got no idea what that phrase really means. Anyway, well, I know what it means, where it comes from. So anyway, I got around and knocked on the door, and the door opened, and here's this guy, and he's bent up and he's on a walking stick. And I thought, oh, well, that's a bit of a shock. And he opened the door and his wife is there, and she's tall and elegant and looked like she might have been the editor of Vogue magazine or something. And he said, "Come on in." And they took me in and we sort of sat around drinking sherry and cheese and bickies or something. Not sherry, we're not that old. But anyway, she said, Colin doesn't remember much of his life before he had the stroke because it affected his memory. And so she said, and I didn't knew him. I only met him when he was recovering from the stroke. We've only been married for a few years now. And so it's good to meet you. So what was he like when he was your teacher?
Let me jog your memory.
I couldn't do it. It would have been cruel. I thought, the guy, life has done to that guy more than me. I was going to go, "You don't know how much of a bastard you were." And boom, I was going to give it to him at the door. And so anyway, she said, "What was he like when he was your teacher?" And I thought, no, I've got to tell the truth. I can't tell her the truth. So I said to her, well, he used to like embarrassing people. It was like sport to him. And she nodded and said, "Yeah." And so she looked at him and she said, "That's like what those 2 girls said when we were out at Condo at the picnic races a couple of years ago." And so somebody else he'd met, previous student, and I don't know what they said. Anyway, I want to talk about mathematics. So if there's a heading for my sermon, it's God's mathematics. And my the sort of Bible verse is something from Ezekiel, which you'll remember, where God says, "I'm going to take from you the heart of stone and put in you a heart of flesh." So this is how God's mathematics works. The first thing God does in our life is subtraction. And he takes from us the things that are toxic. And this is what happened in that moment. It was as if we were sitting there and she said, "What was he like?" And it was, you know, this conversation with myself, as if God was saying, "Do you want me to take that resentment?" And I just let it go. I was happy to let it go. You know, I read just this morning, the person who has the most impact on your life is the person you don't forgive. Now, I'd already written all my notes up. I've been writing these notes for the last few weeks. And so here's this thing this morning, you know, just doing my email, and here's this little meme. The person who has the most impact in your life is the person you don't forgive. God's mathematics is to do subtraction first. And he takes from you the heart of stone. So I'm going to tell you a little story about a guy named Sam who I met in jail. And in jail, people do work in workshops. So Bathurst Jail, we had the contract for repairing or doing sort of warranty stuff on Philips electrical kettles and shavers and things. So if they were returned to the store, well, we'd take them. Some are returned just because the person doesn't want it. And, typical is the man has bought his wife a new electric kettle for Mother's Day because he's got no imagination. His wife takes it back and gets the money back. And, 'cause it's a stupid thing to do to your missus on Mother's Day. And so the guys would sit around the tables and they'd just pull these things apart and put the parts back together. And then if they were working, they'd send them back. So every pallet load of things they'd sent back, they'd be bought by motels and caravan parks and places. And so here's half a dozen guys around the table, and I'd walk through every couple of days. I'd be going through the workshop saying hello, and I met this guy named Sam, who was a Muslim fella. And he was gung-ho, he was into it. As soon as he found out I was the chaplain, he started talking about the importance of prayer and the importance of religious observance and the importance of listening to sermons and the importance of telling other people. So, yes, mate, yeah, I agree, mate. No argument from me, mate. And he was aggressive in shutting me down all the time. But he was also aggressive in herding the other Muslim guys to Friday prayers when the Muslim chaplain come into the jail. Now, for the Kairos program, which I mentioned, we'd just invite people along. We normally went for the heavies who were on top of everybody else in the jail, the bullies and the standover merchants. So you change them, you change the culture in the jail. But I would always invite somebody, and often if there was sort of a homemade Muslim leader, I'd invite him along. So we have Muslim guys in. And this guy came in very nervous. It was November, and it was just after the September 11 attack in New York. He was nervous about how he was treated, but he was treated with grace and love and acceptance. And after Kairos, he said to me, "Can I see you in your office?" And I said, "Yeah." And he came in and he said, "Do you know anything about where I'm from?" And I said, "Mate, I don't know anything. I only know what you tell me." And he said, "I grew up in Beirut when the war was happening." So the war in Lebanon used to be this beautiful country, and then Israel and Syria decided they're going to have their war in Lebanon, just destroyed the place. And I had a twin brother, and a rocket, a missile hit our block of flats, and my brother was killed. And all the neighbours to my parents said, "Isn't it terrible? The Lord has taken the angel and left you with the devil." Because everyone thought the other brother was the nice guy. And so that was the way he was brought up and seen in his community. And anyway, became quite violent. He talked about getting his father's service pistol and taking it to school to shoot somebody once. And luckily, he hit someone's shoe and not their heart. But he got to Australia, and then he was crimes of violence. He was just sparked, boom, bang, into violence. And then he's telling me this story, and then he just stopped and he said, "Will you pray for me?" And I said, "Mate, if you're happy as a Muslim to have me as a Christian pray for you, I'm happy to pray." So I said, "You're just sitting in a chair," and I said, "Just put your hands out." And I said, "Well, just hold on your hands and we'll just pray that God would put something in there." And I said, "Now, when I pray, you might not understand because some will be English, but some of the times I pray, it's not in English." I was praying in tongues with him. "Don't worry about that, just let God do it." And so we're praying there, and I was just praying in tongues, and then suddenly it's as if he relaxed, his head dropped, and then he said, "Wow." And I said, "Just stay where you are, but tell me what's happening." And he said, "There's a light." And I said, "What do you mean there's a light?" And he said, I can just see myself, and there's a family, and we've been having a picnic by a river, and I went walking up along the river by myself, and now there's this light on me." And I said, "Where's the light coming from?" And he said, "Up there somewhere." And he's all just like this. And I said, "So tell me," he said, "It's just gold." And he said, "I'm just shining bright gold." And I thought, whatever you're doing, Lord, just keep doing it. Yeah. And so he just boom there, and I just sat back and waited. And then quite some time later, he sort of came back and he looked up and he said, "Have I been in some sort of trance or something?" And I said, "Mate, I think God just wanted to do a bit of heart surgery, And he said, "I can't remember anything. That must have been minutes ago." And I said, "It was 40 minutes. So he's just there in this state of 40 minutes of God just working something in him. Now, I said, what do you want to do? And she said, I think I just need to go back and sleep, back to my cell and sleep. I said, let's catch up tomorrow. So I caught up with him in the workshops, wandering through the next day and a couple of days after. Calm, peaceful. And in that moment, like, you've got to track people over time, but in that moment, every bit of aggression's gone. All the aggression. He could get into conversation with me, particularly because he saw me as quite threatening. It's why his conversation was always to stop me from talking and make me listen to him. None of that. And the whole aggression thing, it stopped. He couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. But that's what God does. You see, God does subtraction. So the first thing God does in our life often is subtraction. Well, then the next thing that happens is addition. So God takes from us the heart of stone and he puts within us a heart of flesh. So that's the addition where God does. And so all sorts of things happen. So what happened in Sam was that this peacefulness started to flow through to him, from him, and out around the table. Other people noticed it. But there's another story I want to tell you about a guy whose name was Daniel. Now, Daniel is in jail for very violent crimes. You did not want to have Daniel living in your neighbourhood. He's not the guy you want to pass by in the street and look sideways at. And even in jail, he was always involved. He was fighting with officers or abusing officers, threatening officers, and fighting with other inmates. And so in jail, they keep a running sheet of any misdemeanors of inmates. And so they'll have 2 or 3 days locked in cells, all in pound, it's called. So it's not solitary because there's another inmate in there mostly, but he'll be in pound. Just, all right, you're not going to go to the workshop. You won't get paid for those couple of days. And, people do get paid in jail, but not much. And so this guy, Daniel, every week there's 1 or 2 reports on his running sheet. And so all you've got to do to an officer, I know where your kids go to school, mate, you're done. Those things are seen as a threat. You can't do any smart alecky kind of comments to officers without it being immediately stepped on. So this guy, a lot of his time sitting in pound. Now, the problem of that is when he comes up to parole, well, then they look through that and they say, mate, you're in crime, your crimes are all violent, and in jail you've been violent the whole time, parole refused. And so I invited him along to Kairos. And because, as I said, we just go for the worst of the worst if we can. And so what happened with Daniel is that there was this something clicked inside him. Now, Kairos has a week by week follow-up thing in the chapel, as well as chapel service. We have the Kairos thing on a different day. A few volunteers would come in, someone would give a talk, and then a bit of a discussion and just see how you're doing, and mentoring, just Christian mentoring or even just life mentoring. Well, Daniel kept on coming to the weekly follow-up thing, but never really joined in with the prayer times or anything that people had. And so, one of the times we said to Daniel, so what's life like for you? What's going for you? And he said, first off, I really enjoyed Kairos, but he said, I don't believe in God and I don't believe in any religious stuff. But they say, and then they said, well, what are you here for? And he said, well, if I want honesty and integrity in my life, I've got to hang around people who've already got it. And so that's why he came week by week to Kairos. Now, it's not going to have anything to do with God, but maybe God was going to have something to do with him. But what happened was that his behaviour started to moderate, and he stopped getting more things on his running sheet. I mentioned having the electronics, as part of the workshop. What used to happen is associated with that is the TAFE used to send teachers in, and we had people who were signing on to do trades, electrical trades in jail because the TAFE teacher's coming in. Well, Daniel signed on for his first year. I'm going to go back to school, and so he signed on, and so he was sitting there with the electricians lecturers in the workshop, the end of the workshop. And then they said, well, he's doing pretty good after a year or so, and he was doing pretty good. So we'll make him the apprentice to the jail electrician. So one of the officers was an electrician who'd become a prison officer to do the electrical maintenance. And so Daniel became apprentice to our resident electrician. 3 or 4 years later, he qualified as an electrician. So he would have been released into the community with a trade under his belt that would never have happened before. And how did that happen? Because he just wanted something in his life. He just wanted a bit of addition. He wanted honesty and integrity and was going to hang around with the people who had it. And who are those people? God's people. So this is how God does mathematics. And he does subtraction, and then he does addition, and the next thing he does is multiplication. Now, God's good at multiplication. You know, we see it in Jesus. Jesus is there on the mountain, and his disciples come and say, Jesus, there's thousands of people here, and no one's got any lunch. What are we going to do? And he said, well, you feed them. And he said, but there's no one. All we can find is this little kid who's got a Big Mac and some chicken nuggets. So we'll bring him here. And so he just gave thanks over the Big Mac and the chicken nuggets and fed everybody. And it wasn't quite like that, but you know the story. God is into multiplying. The things he puts in his life, he multiplies. I want to tell you the story about a guy named Trevor. Real name, because some of the people here have met him. I think Kath might remember from when Trevor spoke with us one time down when he was out, and lives up the valley. And so I brought him down to Life Church one time, and he spoke when we were down at Denison Street, for all the old people who remember Denison Street. And Trevor was in for armed rob. He would walk into a bank with a sawn-off shotgun and terrorise people, and he was doing 16 years, I think. And then parole for about 4 or 5 years on top of that. So we invited him along to Kairos because he was one of the heavies in the place. And he's also a total fruitcake because of all the drugs he used to take. Our first conversation was when he saw aliens in a spaceship. And the aliens looked up from the bush and he ducked down behind this bush. And then he looked up over the bush and they ducked down behind that bush. And I said, mate, it's my first conversation with Trevor. And anyway, we become friends over time, and I invited him along to Kairos. And his goal coming into Kairos, because in the visit centre, we used to bring the people out of the main jail into the visit centre and have them there all day for 4 or 5 days in a row. And Trevor said, I knew that the visit centre is less protected than the rest of the jail. The walls aren't as high and all that sort of stuff. And he said, I walked in, they got a raised wall there, a brick wall there, there's a guard in the tower, probably with a rifle. And so he said, I came in planning I'll be out of here by Friday. Well, by Tuesday, God had got him. And so anyway, Trev started to grow in faith, and officers a year or so later, I remember an officer saying to me, I think this religious stuff for Trevor might be real. And I said, how do you mean? And he said, well, we see guys get religion, but after 3 weeks, 3 months, it's all gone again. They can't sustain it, but they think there's a benefit. But Trev's been going pretty solid for over a year. So we think it might be pretty genuine. And Trevor was still a tough guy if he wanted to be. And he told a story one time where he came across a guy who was standing over one of the younger guys for his buy-ups. Buy-ups is sort of like the school canteen, the tuck shop. So you can buy cans of Coke and packets of chips and stuff, and put in your order on the Monday and it gets delivered to you on the Thursday. And so here's this guy with his bag of cans of Coke, and here's this guy doing a standover on him, and Trev walks up and said, let him go, mate, he's only a kid, leave him alone. And this guy turned and he said, so what are you going to do, pray for me? And Trevor said, I should say Trevor is like big, he's sort of like a bit like Luke, only more muscly. And he was a big, strong bloke. He gets into the gym and you could, just sort of see the biceps building by the minute and when Trevor starts to work out. And so Trevor just said, mate, either you leave him alone or I'll show you what my life used to be before I become a Christian. And the guy just turned around and walked away. And the young bloke kept his can of Coke. So there was a situation one time where there was a guy, his name was Michael. He was a lovely fella, but he had, one of the inmates, but he had consecutive episodes of severe depression. And his medications would work for a while and then he'd sort of sink below and he wouldn't come out of the cell. And because he's there, a long-term inmate, and so we can muster him in the cell. So muster's like the roll call, 6 times a day, every 2 hours. we muster to make sure that no one's there. Oh, I mean, no one's escaped. Everyone's there. And so normally you've got to be there. But what they were prepared to muster Michael in his cell because he just couldn't get out of the place and he'd scrunch up under the blankets. But after 3 days, they had to get him out and up into the crisis unit, which is another place up on the back end of the jail for people who either attempted or threatened suicide or in this situation that Michael's in. So they couldn't get him out and he just wouldn't do it. And you've got to be careful how much pressure you put on somebody. In the end, they decided we're going to have to do a cell extraction. That means we're going to get 6 guys in riot gear. You've got to get him out because, someone in that they might be totally sort of almost catatonic in depression, but once there's some aggression happening, they can just explode. So the riot gear guys came in, got all their stuff out of the riot gear cupboard and dressed up and came into the wing. And the wing manager, the area manager in charge of the wing said, hang on a minute. He said, go and get Trevor. I've got an idea. So they got Trevor in. And he said to Trevor, mix in here with this depressive thing. We've got to get him to the crisis unit. So I don't want to do the extraction team if we don't need to. Do you reckon you could talk with him? Because I reckon you're probably the only guy who can do it. So Trevor went in there and he just started to talk with Michael, and about 3 or 4 minutes later came out holding onto his hand and arm around him and just walked him up with a couple of officers up to the crisis unit. See, when God starts putting stuff in your life, he magnifies it. And so he sort of multiplies what gifts were put into Trevor's life. Well, let's multiply it to the next level. Let's make it seen so other people can see it. Let's have an impact so that people say, if God can do that to that fella, he can do it to me. Now, you know what's left? We've got we've got subtraction first, and then we've got addition, and then we've got multiplication. Well, God doesn't do division. See, in God's mathematics, God doesn't do division. You want to be divided off, you're going to have to go somewhere else. Remember that first hymn, Leave Your Shame at the Door? And so it wasn't hymn, was it song? First bit, leave the shame at the door, that's not welcome anymore. When people walk into here, I've got my eye on the time here, I'm going to jump. People like to divide. Unfortunately, a lot of churches like to divide. They find people who they can target, and by dividing some people off, it makes them feel good, makes them, well, we are in the in group and that's the out group. And so when I was newly ordained as Anglican priest, well, the ordination of women was the big dividing thing. There are people who say you shouldn't get women ordained as priests, and I was one of the people who voted, yes, we should. And so people say, well, in the New Testament, Paul says you shouldn't have women talking in the church and teaching men. And we say, look, you got it wrong, mate. You just plain got it wrong. And our life is enhanced by including people rather than dividing them off. It still happens in places. I want to talk about when I was growing up in the 50s, we only had 2 kinds of music. Don't you feel sorry for me? They were both as bad as each other. They were called country and western. And people all around the world prayed, God, you've got to give us some new kind of music. And God said, what sort of music? Well, you've got these 2 types. Well, in that case, well, I'll give you another 2 types. And he gave us rock and roll. And, well, the people in the churches went ballistic. Because suddenly here's Buddy Holland singing Rock Around the Clock, and then Elvis turns up and singing, you ain't nothing but a hound dog, and all these teenage girls are screaming their head off, and people in the church are saying, this is the devil coming after our kids and destroying the family. And then Elvis with his hips, and then suddenly he slowed down and he said, love me tender, love me do, and all those girls screaming, they fainted on the floor. And the church has said, we told you so. And we had a time, it's called the Satanic Panic, where everybody got divided off. You like rock and roll, you can't come in here. I've got a friend, his name is Pete, and he's actually played at Friday Chill, got a group called the Outback Hippies, grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, rock and roll guy. He's a wonderful musician. I've known him for 20 or 30 years or so. And but he's talking to his grandma once, and she said, "Isn't it terrible? They said there was someone in the youth group on Friday night, and they were playing electric guitars." And he said, "Grandma, that was me." So let's divide that guy off. Anyway, the devil is after our kids. We see it again still. Satanic pack is back, everybody. Satanic panic is back, everybody, but we see it this time targeting gay and lesbian people, trans kids. It's everybody gets carved off. Drag shows, like the big thing at the moment, there's churches in Victoria wanting to get rid of Drag Time Story Hour at the library. And you know what I found when I started sort of what are you going to say? Like Auntie Jack was the best thing on television. It's a man in a dress, you people. He's just a drag star. And Barry Humphries as Dame Edna Everidge, all over the place. Well, anyway, at the moment, you know what the biggest selling or the most popular song on Christian Spotify is? I don't know the name of the song, but it's by a Christian drag queen called Flamey Grant. So Amy Grant was a Christian singer through the 90s. Well, anyway, there's this guy dressed up as a drag queen, and he's just telling churches, we're here, but the churches, they want to divide off, and it's the same thing. They're coming after our kids, want to destroy the family. People walk in that door and they're welcomed. One of the things we don't do here is division. What we like to see is addition or subtraction, addition, multiplication. We don't do division. You done time? Welcome. You come out of rehab? Welcome. You homeless? Welcome. Your life's a mess? Welcome. There are many here today, many people part of this church, I'm not here today, and that's their story. When I was getting a cup of coffee this morning, I was talking to Steve, and he said, "You talking to Dan?" I said, "Yeah, I'm going to talk about you, mate." And he said, "No, you're not." And I said, "Yes, I am." Only because he's spoken with us. And he's spoken about when he was a football player and he was like a Sherman tank, and you did not want to get in the way of that man on the football field because he was a hard hitter. But his life was too much of that as well. And then somehow he got involved with us here, Soul Cafe. Pardon me. And God started to take away the Sherman tank, and he started to add in a bit of V-dub combi. Well, everybody loves the combi, right? And then he started to do a multiplication. And I remember Kev Wilcox was talking about a guy. He said, I was talking to Steve's brother, and Steve's brother said, "Boy, I don't know what you do down there at Life Church, but if you can make changes in my brother like you have, maybe there's space for me too." Multiplying, you see, this is what God does in people's lives. He multiplies them. And with Susie, we spoke, who's not here today, but she spoke not too long ago about her life. And it was a bit of a mess. You only have to listen to Susie's voice and you say, that voice it's walked some hard roads. I love that character that comes when you listen, because you think, this person knows life from a whole lot of points of view, And I imagine, you imagine somebody whose life, they're doing it tough, and they walk in and Susie says, "Hello, darling, what can I do for you?" And they hear the voice and they say, "I can trust that voice." And that's magnifying. Whatever God has done in Susie's life gets magnified into the lives of others. Alexa spoke to us a few weeks ago, and probably the most magnifying kind of person I can think of at the moment. And she spoke about growing up. The family was not into church, it was all a bit ho-hummers, just nothing much down and there. And then God got a hold of her. And then when she inherited some money, what did she do? She went and bought a motel in Thailand and made it a hostel for people who got nowhere to live. People who'd be begging on the streets or dead in the streets. And what a day it was a month ago when we had that link over, she's there with the phone, and we had the video link, and here's all these people, half of them in wheelchairs. Now that's God magnifying. You see, this is God's mathematics. just to magnify what happens. So here's a question for you. Just imagine someone's life's a bit of a mess, and God starts just taking things out of it, the toxic bits that are holding them up, and then starts doing a bit of addition and puts stuff in, and then starts multiplying so they have an effect on somebody else. So here's a little, not so much a challenge, or I don't want to embarrass anybody, but if you see yourself in that kind of thing, put your hand up. There's a couple of hands up. There's not many. Yeah, there's a few. I was waiting for Luke's hand, mate. We listened to Luke a little while ago and talking about praying for that guy in the street, you know, just getting over whatever hump. And, mate, I think God wants me to pray for you. And the guy said, I'm okay with that. That wouldn't have happened a year ago, probably, 2, who knows? You see, we've got people here who've experienced God's mathematics, experienced the subtraction of the toxic stuff, the heart of stone, experienced the addition, the heart of flesh goes in, empathy, humanity, all the things that we want in our lives for ourselves, but also in the things we want in our community. But people walk in here and imagine somebody like, we get Luke, just because he's here, someone sits at the table at lunch and says, they told me to come here for lunch, and Luke says, these are the most beautiful people you could imagine. This is your first time? Yeah, it's my first time. And he said, you know, he'll say something like, well, God can do stuff in your life here. That's been magnified. So Luke's starting to have an effect on other lives of other people. Doesn't matter who you have in here, there's people who are welcomed, who God wants to do a bit of subtraction, a bit of addition, a bit of multiplication, but no division. No one gets told you don't fit, you don't belong on your way. I was going to talk about a book. I will talk about a book because Jake held up my book. This is a book called F2M, The Boy Within. This is about a girl grows up as a girl knowing that she's a boy on the inside, and as an adult goes through transition and becomes a man. People don't want to hear about these stories. This was published by the same guy who published the book that Jake held up, the guy who published my book. And this is half written by a woman named Hazel Edwards. Hazel Edwards is one of Australia's most prolific children and young adult authors. And her first book, 40 odd years ago, was called There's a Hippopotamus on the Roof Eating Cake. You know it. Now, I met Hazel Edwards when I had just the manuscript of that novel and got mentoring for a few months from Hazel, and then she found a publisher for me, this publisher. She worked with this guy named Ryan Kennedy, and this is the story, like the fictionalised story, of a young girl who's, plays guitar, bass guitar in a rock group, and then inside she knows, I'm a boy in a girl's body. I don't understand that, but that's how it is. All over the world, there are people who are struggling with who they are, and we're starting to believe them. But most churches don't want to know about it because they'll divide them off. That's why I bought this book here. I've spoken with Ryan Kennedy, and he's a New Zealander. It's the most extraordinary story. Anyway, division will happen within the church, and I speak about that, about the LBGT stuff, because that's the target at the moment for the satanic panic. We need to guard against what other churches might do about dividing people off. And so, no, God doesn't do division. God does subtraction, addition, multiplication. And we've got so many people here who've got that testament in their life, but God does not do division. So time for us to finish, I think. It's 5 past something. I don't know what, that clock's wrong, isn't it? The hands are in the wrong places. The little hand says it's 5 to 11 and the big hand says it's 5 past 11. There's no end to this. I haven't got some neat and tidy kind of thing. We're just going to finish up.